Heidi Marshall, the coordinator of the Online Campus Writing Center. And I'm here with Dr. Lonnie Morris. We're going to be talking about note-taking and synthesis. I think at this point, you've probably heard us introduce ourselves more in depth a fair number of times. So I think maybe we'll jump right into it. But I do also want to mention that we have David Sibley, our university librarian, is on with us. He's monitoring the chat box for today's session. So if you have questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat box. David will interrupt us and let us know. And a good portion of this session is going to be dialogue based, right? We want to hear from you. What questions do you have about note-taking, critical reading, and this concept of synthesis? If you are on, I will say, if it wasn't apparent from the title, much of what we're going to be talking about is in context of writing your literature review, right? That's sort of the crux behind this session. So if you feel like you're in the right spot, great. If that was not what you were thinking, feel free. We won't be offended if you pop off, but I think it's going to be really valuable information. I'm going to start us off by talking about some critical reading skills. And this is a model that we endorse in the Writing Center. It's a model that's endorsed pretty broadly across graduate communication professionals. So how do you teach critical writing to folks who are reading really complex articles and documents, right? So we know when you dive into reading, for example, a review of the literature or a meta-analysis, that those are really difficult documents. They're heavy, they're complex, they're in depth, and it can be really overwhelming. I know sometimes I'll read an entire page of an article and feel like I have no idea what I just read, right? You have to reread it, and dive in. So there are some skills that you can do though. And these are really akin to the same kind of skills that you would want to learn for critical writing as well, for learning APA style. Sort of everything about this is a skill set. And I want you to understand that just like any skill, playing an instrument, it's something that can be practiced and can be learned. So it's just because you can't, if you get into complex articles and they feel really frustrating right now, that doesn't mean that's always going to be the case. The more you practice it, the more you get into it, and the more you're doing it with intention, the better and the easier it's going to be to pull information from those articles that you really need. And one thing that both Dr. Morris and I, you'll probably hear us say multiple times in this session, and that maybe like what's said in this session stays in this session, is that, it's okay not to read an entire article. It's okay not to read an entire book, because, reading that cover to cover is not always the most beneficial. Sometimes that's not the purpose of reading that particular article. Now, I'm not saying that you should skim through your course readings, that you can skip things that are on your assigned reading list. That's a very different style of reading. But when we're thinking about reading for a literature review and doing what's called saturating the literature, you want to make sure that you're, again, doing that with a lot of intention. So I'm going to talk about what's called this SQ3R critical reading model. The first one, the S stands for scanning the text. You're looking at the main sections and organization of the article itself. So make sure you understand what type of article are you reading, right? Is it, because there's a lot of different types. Is it an empirical study? Is it a review of the literature? Is it a meta-analysis? What type of article are you reading? How is it organized? Is it organized sort of along those standards of social science, empirical research, where you're going to see a problem presented, you're going to see a brief literature review, then you're going to see a methods section, and then you're going to see results, right? That very standard formatting that we see for those empirical research articles. Or is it organized in a different way? So know ahead of time what to expect throughout that whatever it is that you're reading. And I say article a lot, but I'm really referring to anything in front of you. You're also scanning for currency. Make sure, look at not just the publication date, but if it is an original research article, the date of the research, so when the research itself took place, doesn't always coincide with when the article was published. And that can be really important when you're thinking about your literature review, right? You might say, Morris 2020, found such and such to be true, but it's like, maybe he actually found that to be true in 2015, and we're now just sort of reading an article about it in 2020. So again, make sure you know the currency of that. You're also looking at authority, right? Who is writing this article? Do they have the authority? Are they somebody, are they sort of a leading researcher in the field? Is it a dissertation, or is it published by somebody who's widely published already in the field? Google Scholar can be a really great resource for this. You can see how many times has this particular source been cited itself. So you're looking at that, and also understanding that, so make sure you're skimming and that you understand. If it's a very technical article, that you understand that language, the acronyms, abbreviations, any discipline specific jargon that might be pulled in. So you want to make sure that you have that understanding, that if you are going to skim the text, if you decide that this article is worth diving into, that you're not going to have to be spending a lot of time understanding, that you do that ahead of time. And this is not necessarily a time-intensive process. Or again, the more you get used to it, the quicker all of these steps become. And then this is what I think is the most important, is write down the questions that you have relating to the content, what to expect, and how you expect the source content to relate to the other sources you have already read. So this is what I mean when I say have an intention behind reading everything that you read. Much like if anyone has, I haven't gone to a yoga class in years, but when I used to go to yoga, and many yoga instructors will say, I want you to set an intention for today's practice, right? What are you going to keep at the forefront of your mind as you go through today's class? And I think that concept applies here too. Again, as you're getting into that article, why are you reading it? Are you reading it because your chair told you need to find 3 more sources, to really fill out this thematic section in your literature review? Are you reading it because you're learning more about the methodology that you're going to be using? Are you reading it because the author is using the same theoretical theories that you're pulling into yours? So like, what is your intention? What part of that article do you really need to pay the most attention to, in other words? So have that intention going in. If you don't have that intention and you read it from cover to cover, you're not going to retain very much, right? You're not going to be able to really apply that learning to much. But then you do have to read. I mean, our first R is that you do have to read in some capacity. It would be wonderful if we could just absorb all this, everything we needed with just the scanning and questioning, but you will have to read. Again, don't necessarily need to read that cover to cover. Make sure though that you can, especially if you've deemed that this is a source, it's going to be really critically important to, again, a thematic section in your literature review. You do need to make sure you understand the main ideas, right? And to write those down. Make sure you're able to concisely summarize or paraphrase the author's main ideas from that source. Once you've read it, we're going to say in full, okay? You want to then recite. So I'm sure you've heard this before. I used to teach note-taking at an undergraduate school, and this is something that I reiterated over and over. I don't know that any of my my dear undergrads ever did it, but once you finish, if you come out of a class, a traditional, brick and mortar undergrad, come out of class, and if you're struggling with comprehension, once you finish your class, take a few minutes, get out a notebook, and summarize, what that lecture was like. Right, take your notes right away after you finish reading. Take your notes right away, and I do think that there's some merit to that, right? So after you've read and you've done whatever you sort of read in depth to the extent you've deemed necessary, go back to those questions. Make sure if you had questions going into it, were you able to answer those? Did this article achieve what you needed it to achieve? Was your intention in reading this met, or did it identify new questions, right? Did it take you in a direction you didn't realize? And this is going to happen a lot as you're just getting started. Right, as you're just getting into the literature review, you haven't quite, reached that point of saturation of the information. You're just becoming familiar with the major researchers in your field. You're going to be constantly coming up with new ideas, new questions, new ways to relate all of these sources together. And then you do need to do what's called review and relate. You need to analyze, compare, evaluate the source. What you're doing there is moving into a critical thinking process, right? So you've read critically for that important information. Now you need to think critically. How does this relate to it? And be sure you're analyzing and evaluating. Just because something's published doesn't mean it's good. Doesn't mean that that you have to take it at its word, right? If you are finding that this source is in contrast to what you thought you knew or you knew in the field, or in contrast to other sources that you're reading, that it's okay, right? It's okay to be critical and to critically evaluate sources too. You don't have to have this reverence to the literature, right? It's part of your job in that literature review is to be pretty critical. Dr. Morris or David, anything to add here on critical reading strategies?
No, not yet. But when we get to the toolbox, I have some things I think can help sort of
Okay.
operationalize that.
Well, look, here we are.
How about it?
So we don't have anything on this slide. We're calling it tools for your toolbox because we're just going to dialogue a little bit about some strategies. So Dr. Morris has some strategies he's going to share. I have a couple, but then if any of you in the audience have a strategy that you use for reading and for note taking, we want to hear about that too. You can let David know in the chat and he can let us know, or you can feel free to unmute as well. So Dr. Morris, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. This is very helpful. What I want to share is sort of how I approach this. And I started doing this when I was a doc student as well. And I've been doing this with students who I chair and work with for the last 6 or 7 years. And it's still how I approach research in my own writing right now. So to Dr. Marshall's point, I never read anything cover to cover. Even if it's critically important to my research, I never read it from cover to cover. Every journal article, every book chapter, I approach with a search and find mentality. And for search and find, what I want to recommend to you is think of the core areas of the dissertation proposal that you're putting together, all the things we asked you to write and articulate. What's the research question? What's the purpose of this study? What is the framework they're using? What's the methodology? Who are the participants? All those things. And I basically use a template that has, here's the 12 items I'm looking for in every single thing I read, right? So a few things are important about that. The first is when you approach it from a search and find, now you know exactly what you're looking for rather than trying to read from page 1 to page 35. So now rather than spending, I'll tell you, when I was doing read from cover to cover, 2 to 3 hours trying to digest one article, you can probably move through 3 or 4 in 1 hour. I know what I'm looking for. And as Dr. Marshall mentioned, you're training your mind. Where is this likely going to be? When do they start talking about the purpose of this study? When do they start articulating the research questions? So now you know it should be somewhere in here before I get to this place, and you can find that. And then also, and this has been very helpful for a lot of students I work with, is I use a template. So basically, I have a chart that has those 12 things listed, and I fill in those things as I go through. So now, as you talk about, for some of you, you'll have 150 to 200 sources in your literature review. So now what you have is the exact same 10 to 12 things you've captured from every single source that you've read, and you've got them all in a standard format. So you don't have to search for, well, where did I write the research question for this? How did I write that thing down? So what you now can do is compare apples and apples and apples and apples from every single thing that you've read. Right? So that's the first tool. The second piece of this, I want you to take notes about this as well, is I typically divide the process into multiple stages and recognize that each is its individual stage and respect it as such. So for example, I think when we talk about notes, there's the process of gathering information. So researching in the library, finding things that are important. There's the piece about taking notes and doing that. You've got to write some stuff eventually, and you've got to edit. Where I find, and this again was my own challenge as a student and as I became a scholar, working to become a scholar and had difficulty, is I was always trying to combine all 4 stages into one. So I would sit and search in the library a little bit, write a little bit of notes, take some notes about it, now try to write that into a paragraph and edit it because I didn't like how it sounded. So what eventually would happen, and some of you, I know nobody in this room, but maybe you know somebody who may have spent 3 or 4 hours trying to perfect one paragraph as you've got multiple screens up, or here's the article, here's the thing I wrote about it, here are the notes I have, and it never works, right? So here's what I recommend, and this is how I work now. I dedicate separate times for everything. So Monday might be the day when I'm just gathering information from the library, dumping it into a folder saying, here are the articles I must read, and keeping a trail of that. The next day might be, here's when I'm going to go through all those things that I gathered and just take my notes. Following that, you have a day, here's when I write from the notes that I created, and then I use another day to edit, right? So now you've isolated all 4 steps in the process, and you aren't confusing yourself trying to perfect all of them at once, right? So think through that as we go through some other things here that help you sort of see the end in a different way and how you're approaching this. And again, I can't say this enough. I never, ever, ever read any, even the ones that I write, never read it from cover to cover. Not necessary.
That's great. We've had some requests. If you have that template to share or a link.
Oh, I can show it right now. Or I can,
yeah.
let's
Here,
see.
let me,
can I
think
right
if I think
okay.
I need to stop sharing and then.
Yeah.
I will say too, those of you on, I popped a link into the chat where to the research writing resources on the Online Writing Center website. And there you're going to find what's called a literature review matrix, which is very similar to the template that Dr. Morris is talking about. I'll bring it up. It sort of looks a little bit like this. So as he was, oh, you're not seeing my screen anymore. Whoops. So
yeah, I can't share. You got to give me permission to share.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm trying to do too many things at once here.
We're multitasking together, right? What we just said not to do.
Right.
All right. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So as you can see here, I use Microsoft OneNote for my notes. And this is the template. It's a standard table that has here are all the things I'm looking for. Then I plug in the information here. And I'll show you some examples, right? So if you look at, and this is actually from something I just finished writing. And here's how we plug it in. Going right through, plug in those things. Sometimes what you see around hypothesis, just snipping and clipping and plugging it in. Because some of the stuff you don't need from a note-taking perspective, you don't need to digest all of it at once. And so you'll see that. And I use the same standard throughout. And as Dr. Marshall mentioned, depending on the type of source that you're reading, you may not have all of those things, right? All the elements that we talk about may not be in every single thing that you read. But for my purposes, I at least know where to find it. So if I'm going to write in my, if I'm writing in my paper how there has been evolution of how this concept has been defined, and multiple theorists have defined it in different ways, and it used to have this concept and then they added this concept. So when I have this section here that looks at definitions, right, so I can capture in one space in all of my notes how have these ideas been defined over time, so I can compare that across. All right, I think that's enough for that. And I'm sure there's some requests to have an example of this. I can definitely send out.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And I just want to point out, though, if you notice that if you...
Oh, I'm going to go back to it? Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. But, you know, if you notice how those, you know, those columns were sort of evolving there, right? And you think about it, you're almost writing your literature review as you go, right? Eventually, you're going to be able to just sort of look at those columns and those notes and be like, oh, I'm seeing a draft, you know, an outline begin here too. I'm just going to quickly share an example. I tried to put this file into the chat, and it is, Zoom is not liking that file. So are you able to see this spreadsheet here?
Yeah.
So this is very similar. We call it a literature review matrix, right? Where you have sort of same concept. You're taking notes of all different types, you know, things in the article. You know, was there, if it was an empirical research, what was the sample size, the problem, purpose, research questions, right? And then you're also having columns again where you're beginning to analyze it. You're beginning to synthesize it. So you're making those comparisons to the other literature, right? And then, you know, if you are, because we want you to think about your literature review, obviously thematically, we're going to be talking about that in just a moment. That, you know, are you beginning to understand where is this article fitting in that bigger picture? So, you know, so this is a great way too. And then eventually, you know, if you take, you know, this synthesis column, that's going to be your literature review, right? You're sort of writing as you go. So think about it that way. Okay. Stop share that. So let's go back. I'm sorry, Zoom is really not liking me this morning. It's tired. Here we go. Okay. All right, are we back to the slides here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we were. Yes.
So I wasn't able to add the file, but I did put a hyperlink in the chat to where to find that file so you can download it on your own. So let's talk a little bit about saturation of the literature, right? How do you know when you're done reading for the literature review, when you're done taking notes, when you're done? How do you know? So Dr. Morris, I know that you have a lot to say about this. I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'll chime in too.
Oh, I see your question, Sylvia, and I'll answer that. So first, her question is, do you use the template I just showed us for each article literature review? Absolutely. So I organize it into, and I can show you that screen again, into topics, and then each topic has a page. So what I love about Microsoft OneNote is it has this sort of 3-ring binder setup, right? Remember you had that with the manila tabs in the middle? So you have, here's the tab, so all my things on ethics are in this tab of the notebook. And so then within that tab, all the articles I've read on ethics. So as you saw in that vision, I'll show it again, it sort of is tab and page oriented, right? So everyone has its own page. The other thing I like about this approach, before we get into saturation, because this is connected, is I want you to feel free to stop saving and printing articles, right? Part of this approach of seek and find rather than read cover to cover is, you know, as Dr. Marshall mentioned, you're very intentional about what you're going to get from each thing you read. You find that, and then you're done with the article. You don't have to worry about, I need to save this in case I need it again. What I typically do is on the page for my notes is I keep the link to wherever it is in the library in case I may have been quite sleepy and didn't capture the notes properly or don't remember what I wrote, so I can go back to it if I need to. But most times it's get the things that you need and put that away, right? So you don't need to come back to it. You don't need to continue to hold on to it. There's nothing new that you'll need there. I want you to be okay with it and feel free to say, I'm done with this 40-page article. I can move on to something else. So let's talk about, when is saturation enough? This is the greatest question ever. When do I have enough? Because I get this all the time. Students always ask me, well, how many articles do I need to read? How do I know when it's done? And I imagine some of you are smiling right now because you may have posed that question to other people. Here's what I want you to understand about literature review. There is not a number that fits for anyone. It is about demonstrating expertise. What we're looking for as your committee members, as your readers, as your chair is, do you know this information well enough that I can knight you to go into the community and execute research on this by yourself? You have to demonstrate that you know enough about it. So what does that mean? That means you need to read widely to understand the broader context, and you need to read specifically to be able to narrow it down to the particular thing that you're focused on. And I get questions a lot about, what does it mean with the years? Should I just read the stuff from the last 5 years? What do you know? The answer is you need to read all of it, right? So of course, we want you to be very much, to have a very comprehensive understanding of what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years in the area you're studying. However, we also know that to be an expert on a topic, there's no way you can dismiss the things that happened in the previous decades that led us up to this. Because and I always give this example, right? So people are probably familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence. But emotional intelligence wasn't always a thing. But it doesn't mean people didn't research emotions in the workplace before that. So if I'm going to knight you to go out and talk to people or survey them about emotional intelligence, I want to make sure you understand how this concept evolved over time in literature. So you even talk about, well, what were we looking at before this idea of emotional intelligence came out? And so that might be for whatever your topic is, whatever your discipline is, there are always those things that are new and shiny that we want to talk about now. But if you don't understand there's some seminal work from 1977 that's important to how we got to understand this in 2017, then you've missed the mark. So when I read dissertations and literature reviews, if I see that papers that only cover the last 5 to 10 years, I go, wow, you are really knowledgeable on what's happening now, but you're not an expert. On the flip side, if I see things that are only focused on what happened in the 60s, and I have people even in courses who are citing things from the 60s, and so if any of you are going to ever be in a class with me or in one now, I'll always ask you to show me the paper. If you're reading an article from 1964, I want to see it. Send it to me right now. But you can't just rely on what was said then in 1964, even if it's seminal work, and not understand the context of what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years around that. So it's really, we're looking for you to find what's that sweet spot where you go, I understand it all. I can answer any question that anyone from my committee is going to throw at me. And if not, there might be a few things where you go, well, hey, I didn't see that one. but it doesn't mean you aren't aware that there's some other discussion about that in the larger discourse about your topic, there are other ideas, other things being shared, and you may just decide, you know what, that is a piece of this, but that's not important to what I'm doing here, and here's the reasons why. But you need to be able to justify that, and you only get to do that by reading broadly and widely around it. Is that helpful?
Yeah, there's some great conversation happening in the chat here.
I see a thank you, Jesus.
Yeah. The only thing I want to add to that, and Dr. Morris touched on this, is I like to think about, that saturation of the literature. When do I have enough? Is you really want to think about it as this inductive research process, right? Much like if you were gathering interview data, right? If you were interviewing and reading transcripts for a set of interviews that you did for a qualitative study, right? You have to reach saturation there too. And the way you know that is that no new themes are emerging, right? That you're starting to see the same people reference the same things or talk about the same things, right? So that's what we mean when we say saturation of the data. It's the same concept with the previously written data, right? So these data, this information, it needs to be saturated in much the same way. And you can know that there's some really great clues. So if you're reading a source and you're looking, you should always be looking in the reference lists. That's something, actually, I should probably add that to my steps for critical reading, right? That probably one of the most important elements of any article is its reference list, because that's where you're going to find, as Dr. Morris was just saying, the foundational sources, like where are they pulling on? So look at that reference list. But then when you begin to see articles where you're like, this reference list looks real similar to the other reference lists, that, I'm being redirected back to sources that I've sort of already read, that is a really great clue that you've begun to saturate that literature, right? That you've begun to exhaust all of that foundation that you need to be standing on.
And let me add to that, because I think this discussion of references is really important. In my note structure, in the OneNote notebook that I keep, or whatever tool you use for it, I keep the program manager language for it is parking lot. But I keep a parking lot of all the things that are mentioned in what I'm reading that I need to also go get. Yeah. Remember, in my process, I separate things from, I do data gathering on one day, note taking on a different day, writing on a separate day. So I never stop what I'm reading to go find the other source. Mm-hmm. But I'll slip that here's the thing that was referenced, and I drop it on the page, say, I've got to go get this the next time I'm doing my data gathering. Here's something that was referenced, and I need to figure out more about what they're saying if it's important to what I need. So I keep a running list of those things. And as I move on to my next data gathering day, I go down that list first. Here's what I've found, here's what I need to get, and then I check it off as I get it. And I can show an example of that when we get to the end as well. Right. So it's about organizing the process that helps you move through in a systematic way, in an efficient way, rather than spending 4 hours on the 140-page journal article.
Yeah. So I do want to spend some time talking about the difference between annotation and synthesis, because much of what we're talking about right now, this data gathering, this note taking, really what you're doing is you're creating an annotation, right? Sort of this comprehensive annotated bibliography, if you will, right? And I know that many of you, if you have not yet been tasked with creating an annotated bibliography, you will be, right? These are sort of the foundational steps to writing a literature review, to making sure that you're understanding what you have read. So you are going to have classes where it's just like, give me a list of 10 articles. I want the full reference citation. And I want, maybe you're going to have to put the abstract in there, but you're going to have to write a paragraph or two, critically summarizing that article, right? Talking about how it might relate to your own research. So that's called an annotation. But it's very different from the literature review itself, from what you need to accomplish in that chapter 2, which is what we call synthesis. You have to then begin to synthesize all of those individual annotations into this greater understanding. You're creating new knowledge. So we have a couple things. So Dr. Morris likes to say, so we're going to talk about the pitfalls, right? So the pitfalls of a literature, sort of the
parade of articles. There you go. I love it.
I know that was like the best open use picture I could find of a parade. Creative Commons was limiting because it's rather nondescript, right? So these are sort of common pitfalls that we see, is that you sort of present your literature review as an annotated bibliography, and you've just taken those reference citations out, but it's exactly the same thing. It's just, here's what this article is, here's what this article, here's what this book said, here's what this person said, right? It's just this parade of ideas.
Puts me right to sleep.
Yes, and it's fine, right? It maybe it's showing that you do understand what you read, but you haven't generated any new knowledge, right? You haven't told me why is this important, right? I don't need, you know, the point of the literature review isn't to show that you've read all the articles. The point of your literature review is it's a rationale for your research, right? It's really a persuasive research paper where at the end of it, as a reader, I'm going to understand that your own study is critical to filling a gap, something that's missing, right? So you're telling a story in this literature review. It's got to be a critical essay. It has to be cohesive. It's not just a parade of ideas, because if I just read a parade of ideas, I have no idea where your idea fits in, right? Why then do you need to, if all this exists, where do you fit in, right?
Can I add something to that really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I like to think of it, and sort of the metaphor that I use for it is it's environmental scan, right? And so think of it as if you're using the dissertation to get funding for something. So literature is about getting funding. So what you have to demonstrate to us is you're aware of what else is going on in the market, and here are the flaws with those things. And here's what you're going to do that is so powerful and so critical and corrects these things that you've identified are wrong, that we've got to give you money to go do that, right? So it is making an argument about where other people have messed up. And that's okay. Sometimes that's hard because you think, I'm just a student. How dare I criticize these scholars and people who've published 30, 40 articles, multiple books on this? But that's the role of scholarship, is you have to find, and it may be that they've been doing this well all the time. It could be something as simple as, and I see this often, the scholars in this area have used this one theory way too much. In my area of organizational leadership, I say this all the time about transformational leadership, right? It is applied in every single thing. So if you wrote that, here's how they've applied this, and they have exaggerated its application, they have overused its utility, here's why we need to have a different lens from a different literature, a different leadership literature, right? That's the argument you're making. You are making me understand why other people have messed up and why yours is the greatest.
Yeah.
Can I just add that if you remember what I said about theory yesterday, if you were in that session, this is where literature reviews also inform how you might use a theory within to justify your entire research design.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. So related to sort of the pitfall of the parade of ideas is also what I call the synthesis sandwich, where you've maybe moved beyond the parade, right? You've sort of put it in a container, right? And I understand now that so at the outset, what I call this is like the first few pages of a literature review are actually very well synthesized ideas. You've identified themes in the literature, and you've presented like, here are the ideas that I've presented, but then the body of it is that synthesis parade, right? One idea here, one source says this, one source says that, and then maybe there's a final paragraph or two of synthesis, right? So you're getting there, but the bulk of it still isn't critically woven together, because what you really are doing is putting together like a puzzle, right? You're taking all of these different ideas and you have to create a holistic new body of knowledge, right? That's really what you're doing. And I'm just moving through kind of quickly because I want to make sure we have time for some dialogue at the end. But just to reiterate, so your annotation is that detailed summary of the source, right? Maybe your rationale for why you've included it in your own work. It can certainly, we're not bashing that annotated bibliography, because I think they do serve a purpose, right? It can help you organize your thoughts about a particular source. It helps you identify which sources you will and will not include, right? Sometimes we have these articles that we just love, right? Or researchers that we really are drawn to, but you gotta, if they don't have a place, they don't have a place, right? Sometimes we have to let those go, right? And figure out where we need to fill in the gap. So that's annotation. But with synthesis, what you're doing is it's a critical representation, again, of the most relevant current knowledge, right? That's in your field. And what you're doing is you're forming analyses, again, comparison, contrast, evaluating. But the ultimate goal is that you are creating that cohesive, holistic picture for the reader, where they are going to have a very clear understanding of where you and your research and your perspective fit in. Okay, so you're going for that cohesive, holistic whole. On the page, because we get this question a lot, like how many sources do I need to cite in every paragraph, right? Do I have to cite every sentence? So I just like to put this slide in visually, right? Like what does it look like to critically discuss research? And we had this question yesterday in our writing session too, because we have a lot of students will come and say, well, my instructor told me I was only allowed to use parenthetical citations. So that's where you make an assertion and then you cite it in parentheses at the end of the sentence, right? That parenthetical citation. But when I'm reading, I see these narrative or what's called these in-text citations a lot. So why aren't I allowed to do that? And there's a difference between, again, it's all about your intention, right? So you want to use those parenthetical citations or for when you are making an assertion, you're giving us information, you're building an argument, and you are just saying this stands, right? There are enough people in the field. I've gone back, even though I'm citing this one source, it was built upon a foundation of previous researchers, right? That this assertion is just holding true, right? It's just part of my argument that I'm building. That's where a parenthetical citation, you make the assertion and you cite it, right? But in the literature review, what we're talking about, where sometimes you need to sort of critically evaluate and compare sources, this is where that narrative citation comes in, because I'm saying, Marshall has suggested X is true. However, more recent research has sort of disproved that. And so this is where that narrative and engaging the author names in the text of the sentence actually makes more sense, because it's important, right? We actually need to know that these are, different researchers coming in. So it's really about what is your intent on that. And so
can I add something to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is a really good example, because I think what it highlights for me is the discussion of the scholars in the space. What I see often, and we didn't mention this in the other slide about some of the pitfalls of it, is sometimes the literature review is written in a more practical way. And so you're reading about how people are doing things, when really at the PhD level, dissertation level, you are primarily focused on the theory behind what's happening, right? So we're discussing what's the philosophy of this, right? What's the philosophy of what's happening? So it's more about people are doing this in the workspace. I mean, it's less about people are doing this in the workspace, and it's more about how researchers are approaching this topic in their work. How are they researching it? How are they applying it? What results are they getting? And your discussion of that is showing that you have a command of the scholarship of this area. That's really important.
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna just, rather than sort of reiterate this, I want to come back to that. But so this is just to piggyback on what Dr. Morris was just saying. The analogy I use for that very idea is that you want to sort of think about your literature review as entering into a party, right? A dinner party that you've been invited to. Like, let's just say your chair has invited you to a dinner party where like the most esteemed researchers in your field are there, right? But you are just a lowly grad student. You are not yet like among this peer group. I would argue with that, but like, we're just for the sake of, for the sake of analogy, right? So we're here at this party, cocktails are being served, right? And you come in and you don't know anyone. The only person you know is the person who invited you there, right? And has helped you, sort of guided you. So you sort of know, you see a cluster of people, you know who they are, you know probably what they're talking about. You see another cluster of people, you know who they are, right? And if we do that, we just think about the last time you went to a party. Well, remember when we could go to parties and, right? But you went to a party and you didn't really know very many people. What do, right? Depending maybe on how many cocktails you have, you might walk right up and just start talking, right? You might just say, hey, here's, my name's Heidi, here's what I have to say on this topic, without listening to the conversation, right? But that is really not a great way to introduce yourself to a group of academics who feel very strongly about their own research, who have their own philosophical stances on why they approach their research the way they do, why they use the theories they do, right? These are not like things they've just done on a whim. They've already done their due diligence to be at this dinner party. So what do you have to do? You have to listen to the conversation, right? So if you really want to join the conversation over here, you can go and you're going to sort of hover, right? You're going to just sit there and you're going to sip your glass of wine. You're going to listen to what everybody's saying, and you're going to understand, okay, Dr. Morris is taking this perspective. Dr. Sibley is taking this perspective, Dr. Marshall is taking this perspective, and here is how the conversation is evolving based on that conversation, right? And only once you have a really good command, as Dr. Morris just said, a really good command and really good understanding of that conversation, that's when you can interject, right? That's when you can say, here's who I am and where I fit in to this. So it's really that is what you're trying to do in this literature review. I also want to come back here because this is just a quick visual for, we've been talking, avoid the parade of sources, avoid that sandwich, right? What you have to do is think about, and I saw in the chat, many of you use Mind Manager or like to sort of map rather than have that linear outline. And I think that's really smart because you don't necessarily know how that puzzle is going to come together until you have all the pieces for it, right? So you want to say, okay, here's, theme, it could be issue or theme A, theme B, theme C, right? And then all of the sources that sort of contributed to the development of that theme. That's really what we're looking for in that literature review and that organization component. So we have here about 5 or 6 minutes. Dr. Morris or David, do you have anything to add? Or if anyone in the audience has questions, anything in the chat we didn't?
I do want to show, can you show? Yeah, I do want to show something else on my screen that I said I would.
Yep, go ahead.
Let's see if I can do that while we get to all of their questions. Let's see, I think this is it. This must be it. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. All right, so this is what I talked about in terms of the parking lot. So this is actually a notebook that I used for a project we just finished. And we're talking about the organization of it. And you don't have to use OneNote as a tool, but whatever tool that you use, think about it in these ways. So what you see here is each tab is for the different topics of focus. And so this is the tab for all the things about negative leadership behaviors. And then here, what you see is each page is a different source on that topic. Again, each one has the same format, right? So it's the same template, but now you've got this collection of here are all the things I've read about the particular topic. And the parking lot here, I can show you, is really just how I use it is just a screen snipping. When I see it being referenced in whatever I'm reading, screen snip it and dump it onto this page. And as I go back and look at more research, then I check it off when I've read it, right? So you have sort of that functionality here, the live functionality in this, but it happens in other tools as well. You say, hey, I've read this, I dumped it into my notebook already, and there you have it. That's the example I wanted to show.
Can I just say that's a really great idea that I never even thought of using OneNote for?
Yeah. And oh, and then this is it. So I tell you, I don't save it, but I hyperlink the article to the page where the notes is. So on all of the pages I use, the title that I use, this is where the hyperlink is to the article in the library. So if I'm not clear about something I wrote here, or if I don't remember, or say I had to be able to find that, then I can just click here and it takes me right back to the article in the library. So you don't need to actually save the document itself.
Yeah, I know I do something similar, only I save everything to OneNote and use that link because then I also add it to my citation manager in my citation manager notes. So I always know where my master PDF file is.
Yeah.
Because I'm also terrified that I will randomly lose everything. And
yeah,
that's just a nightmare for me.
Totally understand.
Yeah.
Do we have questions? Comments, thoughts, things you want to share, your own expertise?
I'll jump in, but I kind of always jump in. This is great. I wish I had sort of waited for this impulse. I bought us a subscription to FileMaker Pro because I knew that I needed a database, and I also I've been sort of concerned lately that I may have a reading problem, or just that I'm exhausted and I've been in school for a very long time. So I kind of expressed this to my chair, and I had been thinking about like some PDF that would read out loud, because I find myself circling. First of all, thank you so much for giving us permission to focus on one thing at a time. I did spend like 6 hours on a paragraph. It's
in there, buddy.
fantastic, yeah. By the way. It better be less than 6 hours on it. But she told me about Kurzweil 3000, which changed everything. Mm-hmm. So not only am I now reading strategically, so I'm also not reading the whole article anymore. Thank sweet baby Jesus. But I'm moving through the article, and what's happening is, but I still am not ready to let go of paper yet, because I'm sort of reading it. Kurzweil is reading, and I'm following the bouncing ball, so I'm not thinking and also trying to get through the technical prose, and I know what I'm looking for. So I think that the biggest takeaway that I'm going to take from this session really is not the parade of articles, because I was sort of thinking maybe that's what I was going to do, because I was telling a story. And this idea of saturation, I'm beginning to see some of the same articles, but I'm also starting to see new things. So it's just really fascinating watching this process happen. As I'm improving some of the things that I'm learning, some of the mechanics, but I'm also beginning to really understand an article, which is challenging sometimes. So I don't know, I guess I wanted to say thank you for giving us some permission to do things in a way that I was sort of already moving towards, but kind of worried that maybe I was cheating, but really I'm not. I'm really like moving smartly.
Yes, you're working smarter. Definitely. And I want to say, so I'm glad you mentioned Kurzweil 3000. So if you are someone who feels like you're struggling with reading comprehension, there are tools out there. The school has a subscription to Kurzweil 3000, which is a great, it's a way to have the article read aloud. You can annotate within it. I was just going to ask you to post a link in there, David. So David just posted a link to where you can find that tool. There's a manual that goes along with how to use it. So I do recommend that. But unfortunately, we are out of time. So if anyone has additional questions or thoughts, please feel free to follow up with Dr. Morris, myself, David. And it looks like Dr. Morris is posting some more things in the chat. So we'll keep this open for just a couple minutes, but then we are going to have to wrap up because we have one more, the breakout sessions. Please come to those. There will be wonderful faculty-led sessions.
I just want to quickly ask, could you guys ever do like because Dr. Morris's is excellent because it shows the finished product. I would love a session where it is like start with a blank slate and we have it open on our end too and go step by step. Like here's how you do the link. Here's how you drop it in here. Like in the future, because this has been incredibly helpful. So I'm really grateful for the session.
Good.
Sarah, I got some good news for you. I've done one of those. I can send the recording to Dr. Marshall. And if you want, we can set up one. I can do another one. We can do it as soon as next week.
I would love that. Right. This is so helpful. I've been spending way too much time reading full articles.
I'm sure you have. Absolutely. We'll do it. And Dr. Marshall and I will work on it and we'll do it for you. Oh, yeah, let's do it within a week.
Yeah, we'll do it because I think it'd be great to add that to the conference resources for this session too. So
I got you.
All right. We'll see you all in a few minutes.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.